this time. Hello and welcome, Excellencies, distinguished guests. My name is Claire Davan. I will be moderating this session. I am a World Bank consultant working on governance projects in sub-Saharan Africa, including Kenya and Mozambique. I will be moderating today on commodities, raw materials, and we are excited about this session today. As you know, the cross-cutting thing of this 2022 edition of MEDays is to question today's state of affairs and discuss the emergence of a new world order. As a brief introduction, I'd like to mention that 2 days ago, the Harvard Business Review published an interview of a columnist of the Financial Times, Mr. Rana Forhuar. She talked about her new book called Homecoming: The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. In it, she summarized the last 50 years of globalization as being fueled by three things: cheap capital, cheap energy, and cheap labor. She goes on to assess that these three things are all ending. Interest rates are going up. The invasion of Ukraine has made energy more expensive, and wages in Asia are rising. So it can be said that our economic pendulum is shifting from unfettered globalization to a more regionalization and localization trend. We have about an hour and a half to explore this topic all together with our 7 speakers. It's a vast topic, so I will introduce each one of them. Our first panelist is His Excellency Mr. Osama Kamal, former Egyptian Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources, someone who's for over 40 years been managing resources in the oil and gas mining industries in Egypt, the Middle East, and the North Africa region. His Excellency brings an unmatched perspective on ways governments in the South deal with managing their natural resources. Our second panelist is Mr. Bill Rammel, former Minister of State in the UK, former President of the University of Kurdistan, Huller, and currently President of Zoom Abroad. A former elected and appointed British politician, Mr. Rammel will help us reflect on the latest North-South dynamics. Our third panelist is Mr. Hamid Nourou, Director of the World Food Programme at the African Union Office, World Food Programme representative to the AU Commission and UN Economic Commission for Africa. A veterinarian by training, with in-depth field experience in at least Botswana, Kenya, Sudan, India, and Ethiopia, Mr. Nourou will explain the importance of high-level South-South political engagement and the necessity to mobilize forces to strengthen these South-South partnerships. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Patrice Fourladoza, Chairman of the think tank Resources, Chairman for Africa of the Centre d'études et de prospective stratégique in France. One of the top French environmental experts, with decades of experience with global leading companies in development, construction, operation, infrastructures. Mr. Fourladoza brings an unmatched perspective on assessing regulatory frameworks for essential service delivery to population in the Global South. Our fifth panelist is Mr. Andreas Kramer, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation of the Mercator Foundation in Germany, as well as the founder of the Ecologic Institute. Someone who is passionate about researching and teaching interactions between policy domains and international relations. Mr. Kramer will reflect on the global governance on environment, resources, climate, and energy. Our sixth panelist is Mr. Suat Kiniglioglu, Executive Director of the Ankara-based Center for Strategic Communication, Stratim, a politician with a career in politics in Parliament. Our seventh panelist is Mr. Alexandre Kateb, economist and consultant in finance and strategy, an economist and finance specialist by training, with decades of senior advisor roles for various bank-related organizations. Mr. Kateb offers a reflection on the future of the MENA region and the BRICS. So just as a reminder, we have about 3 minutes per question, but our first speaker His Excellency Mr. Osama Kamal will be talking a bit longer and giving us a broad understanding, overall understanding of the new realities of raw materials in 2022 and how you would describe it. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for participating with this selective gathering. And if you don't mind, I'm going to speak in Arabic, because we're touching base with some sensitive issues. So the translation, if it doesn't go well, it might make some troubles. So, أنا هتكلم عربي لأن أنا لاحظت إن معظم الناس الموجودين في الصالة except for the panelists ممكن يفهموا باللغة العربية. And I'm following the translator. So if something is shifted, I'm gonna correct. لما بنتكلم على إدارة الموارد الطبيعية فده موضوع حساس جدا، لأنه الموارد الطبيعية قد ما تكونش موجودة عند ناس كتيرة، عند بلاد كتيرة، وبالتالي لابد أن يكون هناك شيء من الجوفرنانس أو الحوكمة في استخدام الموارد الطبيعية على مستوى العالم، حيث لا يستأثر بها لا المنتج ولا القوي، يتمتع بها الكثير، لأنها موارد طبيعية خلقها الله لخدمة كل الناس مش لحد بعينه. هذا الأمر الحقيقة ما بيحصلش بطريقة يعني طبيعية زي ما احنا شايفين. فنجد أن هناك بعض منتجي البترول والغاز ممن يتحكمون في الأسعار، سواء بخفض كميات الإنتاج أو بتحديد سقف معين للسعر لا ينزل عنه. ونجد أن هذا يحدث أيضا من بعض المستخدمين، ليس فقط من تجاه المنتجين، ولكنه يحدث أيضا من بعض المستخدمين الذين لهم مصلحة في عدم ارتفاع الأسعار، لأن ده بيؤثر على سلاسل الإمداد بكلها. ولعل أبسط مثال على هذا ما رأيناه خلال الأزمة الأوكرانية الروسية الأخيرة من ارتفاع أسعار الغاز بطريقة غير مسبوقة ليتخطى $40 برمليون BTU، وهذا الرقم أدى إلى ارتفاع أسعار الأمونيا اللي هي المدخل الرئيسي لصناعة الأسمدة على مستوى العالم، ومن ثم انعكس هذا على سعر سلاسل الغذاء بالكامل. طيب من الذي تأثر بهذا الارتفاع الجنوني في الأسعار؟ هل هي الشعوب الغنية التي تستطيع من خلال قوتها المادية أنها تحصل على الغذاء بأي طريقة، أو الشعوب المنتجة للحبوب بوجه عام، أم تأثرت بها الدول الفقيرة والدول المستهلكة؟ الحقيقة أنه أكثر المتضررين كانت الدول الفقيرة، لأنه أسعار الوقود والغذاء بالنسبة لهم زادت جدا، وده عمل حالة شديدة من التضخم في الأسعار، نقدر نقول إنها انفلات في الأسعار في بعض الأمور. ويمكن وأنا ماشي النهاردة هنا في طنجة وببص على أسعار البترول، لقيت إنه في حدود 16 درهم. 16 درهم ده يعني إحنا بنتكلم تقريبا في $2 برليتر، أو $1.50 برليتر. ده رقم صعب شوي، وطبعا تأثيراته على مناحي الحياة كلها غالية، لأنه احنا عارفين ان الوقود بيجر وراه أسعار كل شيء، أسعار الخضار، أسعار الفاكهة، أسعار الأسمنت، أسعار الغذاء، أسعار الانتقالات، أسعار كل شيء، كل حد بيتأثر. وبالتالي لما نيجي نقول لابد يبقى هناك دبلوماسية في إدارة الموارد، لابد مع الدبلوماسية أن تكون هناك قواعد جيدة للحوكمة، لأن هذه اللعبة لابد أن تدار بشيء من العدالة إن أردنا أن نقول. والعدالة المطلقة لله طبعا، لكن لما نكون بنتكلم مع دول عظمى ودول كبرى تتعامل في موارد طبيعية سواء هي بتنتجها أو تتحكم في حركة تجارتها، فبنأمل منها هذه الدول العظمى أن تكون لديها سياسة عادلة تجاه توزيع هذه الثروات ومحاولة عدم زيادة الضرر على الفقير. هذا الأمر برضو شفناه يعني بوضوح أثناء أزمة كوفيد في عامي 2021 مع عدم تداول الطعومات اللي هو الفاكسينز يعني بطريقة جيدة. وجدنا أن بعض الدول الغنية دول العالم الأول توفر الطعومات لشعوبها فقط دون أن تنظر للآخرين، حتى مع وفرة الطعومات في هذه البلاد. فزي ما بنقول لابد للموارد الطبيعية كانت طبيعية أو موارد مبنية عليها، لابد أن تكون هناك سياسة عادلة فيها شيء من الحوكمة والوضوح بما لا يؤثر على سلاسل الإمداد وتواجد البشر على وجه الأرض. شكرا.
Thank you very much for highlighting the importance of fairness in managing these resources, and you also mentioned the hoarding of the countries in the north with the vaccine that was.
I didn't mean the country. I said the rich countries.
The rich countries. Yes.
I didn't mean no rich. Just the rich countries.
Well noted. Well noted. Thank you very much. We still have a few minutes with you, Mr. Kamal. So would you have a point about how to better the ways in which governments in the global south could deal with it? How could we work on improving on that fairness?
Regulations, having regulators. We know that every country in the world have their own regulators. We have regulators in Europe, we have regulators in the States. So we do like to have some international regulators looking after this. And surprisingly, some of the first world leaders are not part of such regulator bodies. Let's look to the OPEC. The States is not part of the OPEC. So now the States are looking for having a seal to the oil prices, despite of being not part of the OPEC, not despite of being the largest producer of oil in the world. So we should have some international regulation rules that are followed by all the key players in the raw materials, not only leaving the matter for the supply and demand. No, it's not fair for the poor people and the developing countries. There should be a regulation, and this is part of the governance, actually.
Thank you very much. That leads me to our second speaker, Mr. Ramo. Could you talk a little bit about the recent disruptions as well in the global economy, what we've experienced this past few years, and what it means for the North-South dynamics?
Okay, thank you. I think COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, Chinese moves away from liberalisation towards pure self-interest, and the imperative of decarbonisation have all contributed significantly to raw materials being subjected to unprecedented price volatility and squeezes on supply and greater global inequality. We do therefore, I think, need, and there are many calls to revise and re-energise diplomatic doctrines of resource and commodities. COVID-19 has already suppressed supply chains around the world, and now the war in Ukraine has thrown a further major disruption at commodities, the oil and gas that remains critical to today's energy security, and the minerals we need to continue electrifying and hit net zero carbon goals. The Russian impact, I think, has been extreme, driving up energy prices, squeezing supply and fueling global inflation back to levels we last saw in the 1970s and 1980s. But that's not all. To state the obvious, the pandemic and the war are having a severe impact on geopolitics. And China, the number one supplier of commodities essential to the US and others for renewable energy initiatives, is now contemplating new trade agreements to buy up Russia's unused mineral supply as well. I also think China's move away from liberalisation, the transition of Xi Jinping to become paramount leader, and the moves to strengthen the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy by tightening ideological control and reviving Maoist and Marxist principles within China, and China's move from its traditional low-profile foreign policy towards a more assertive approach, are all contributing to commodities supply volatility. Throw into the mix the fact that Taiwan produces 80 to 90% of US microchips, and China's potential intentions towards Taiwan, and the volatility could be even more extreme. And Chile has just approved an early-stage proposal to nationalise its copper and lithium industries, which threatens more constraints on the global supply chain. So commodities supply and the challenges associated with them are preeminent, but I think some have argued persuasively that these challenges have been expunged from multilateral agendas. So I think we do need a new diplomacy focused on commodities. We need, through particularly US engagement, to seek, difficult as it is, to persuade and incentivise the Chinese away from isolation and hardline what I would call China first policies. We need to stand united against the Russian aggression and support Ukraine. My time as a UK foreign minister exposed me to the ways that major European powers, France, Germany and the UK too, often ploughed their own furrows and got divided and ruled over by Moscow. And I think in that regard, Olaf Scholz's visit to Moscow worries me as well. We have to push and use statecraft and diplomacy to work together and see the interdependence which affects us all. And I think the recent short-sighted decision by OPEC Plus to cut production quotas whilst the global economy is struggling so much with the impact of Putin's invasion of Ukraine comes to mind here. And I think Joe Biden was right to argue that we need to look for additional tools and authorities to reduce OPEC's control over energy prices. And that has to be an international, a genuinely international effort. We need, I think, as well, a reassertion of the importance of open markets and free trade as the best means of delivering sustainable and affordable commodities supply. We need to work economically together to coordinate, to mitigate against boom and bust cycles in commodity markets, which can be enormously disruptive to all of us, but particularly to developing economies, especially the poorest countries. So greater economic cooperation, and I would argue a renewed push for the Tobin tax to stabilise markets and particularly to disincentivise speculation, which can have such an impact on price volatility. We need agreement as well on coordination of fiscal and monetary and regulatory frameworks, so that governments should put in place frameworks that use periods of high prices to build what you might term rainy day funds, which then can be drawn down in emergencies. We need to coordinate and push for greater diversification so we can achieve more competition, strengthen institutions and reduce distorting subsidies. And we need a renewed push on multilateral debt alleviation to support the poorest countries, which are most affected when commodity squeezes and price volatilities takes place. All of this, and we need some really urgency injected into the process.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramel. A very dire picture of the commodities realities between North and the South. We'll now move to Dr. Hamid in the room, and we will be pondering over the notion of one of those raw materials, which is food.
Thank you very much, Claire, and happy to be here. This was a very difficult topic when it was suggested to me, commodities. Is food a commodity? Should it be a commodity? Is food a raw material? When we look at the trends that we see, globally now, in terms of the new reality, and from the food perspective, we have almost 900 million people in the world today who are hungry. And this is up significantly since last year. In Africa alone, in 2021, we had 119.8 million people hungry. Today, just 1 year later, we have 187 million people, and it's getting bigger and bigger. This gap is becoming more and more every single day. And when you look at food as a commodity, I think we need to look at how we classify these commodities, because food is life-giving, it's life-sustaining, it is what, if you don't eat, you don't live. It's as simple as that. Whereas other commodities support the food industry, like fertilizer, like fuels and things like that, yes. And then other commodities such as gold, silver, oil, you can't eat that, you can't drink that, and that means nothing to the man on the street if the man on the street is hungry. So we need to put this really, I think, in perspective. And when it comes to the issue of diplomacy, a hungry person has nothing to do with diplomacy. They need to eat. That's what the bottom line is. The figures are staggering, 56% increase. We have more than 61 million kids in Africa alone who are stunted, permanently stunted for life. We have 12 million who are wasted. And the figure goes on and on. Potentially next year, because of the problems we're having this year and climate change and droughts and things like that, we have the potential already we have in countries like Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Ethiopia, we have droughts. People are already beginning to die of hunger. And other countries like Kenya, Sudan, and the Sahel region are potentially going into that next year. And mainly also because of conflicts. Now, if you look at in terms of strategic reserves, because when you look at a commodity, you look at where it is produced and where you have strategic global reserves. If you look at things like maize, rice, sorghum, and wheat, there are only 5 or 6 or 7 countries in the world that produce these products for export. And if you look at rice, for example, rice is produced for exports in only 7 countries, and yet only 3 countries in the whole world have the strategic rice reserves. 68% of rice reserves are in these 3 countries. And the list goes on and on when you're talking about commodities and food as a commodity. Last year in Africa, we had, the figure varies, between 45 billion to 60.8 billion that was imported into the African continent, basic food materials, just basic staple foods, for foods that could actually be produced in Africa if we had taken care, or we can take care of the 4 C's, conflict, climate change, the cost of food, and of course COVID, or I would put it as other diseases, not just COVID. So the potential really is there. So can Africa really, and not just Africa, but the world, it doesn't matter where you are, you're a person, whether you're in China or in America or in Africa, you need food. We do have bread baskets, and when you have a slight change in a bread basket, as we see in Ukraine, which used to be a world bread basket, and yet in Ukraine today, you see lines for food. WFP is there helping them to support them with food. So it's such a very fragile state of affairs. And we really need to look more in depth, with that, I think, because Africa has got the potential to produce. And we used to have bread baskets in Zimbabwe, in Sudan, and many other countries, but today they are not producing. In fact, they haven't produced for many, many years. Why? Globalization, bring it from where it is cheapest, but it doesn't mean that you needed to neglect what you are doing. And right now, food security is a matter of national security as well, because most of the unrest that we're seeing is because people are hungry. And last but not the least, the youth also are coming into this. They are now demanding food. They are now demanding their rights, and food is a fundamental, basic human right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Earlier, when we prepared the session, you also talked about the South-South partnerships and the importance for countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, to take examples on countries that were maybe in their situation a few decades ago. Would you like to expand a bit on that?
Yes, thank you. So traditionally what you've had is a North-South kind of a relationship, okay? And this goes back from historical backgrounds. If you have a country which was colonized by Britain, like Botswana, my country, or Nigeria, you normally just you cut and paste, in your country. But what we're tending to see nowadays, in fact, in the last 10 years, I would say, is a shift from that North-South kind of dynamic. We in Africa are now looking more towards countries which have been in very similar situation to us, just within our lifetime. So countries like India, countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, that were going through a lot of food insecurity and crisis, and African countries now are moving towards those kind of countries to learn from them, because they have seen them now evolve with their people, with their youth, with their policies, with their governments, with their leaderships. So that kind of dynamic now is changing towards, let's look at countries that have been through this just like us in our lifetime and adopt from them. The second and last point is, we're also looking at a trend in which the youth are getting much more involved in this kind of South-South collaboration because of new technologies, new innovations that are, ways of communicating and sharing ideas, and not just cutting and pasting, but looking at how it applies to your country, and then pasting what you need for your own specific fit-for-purpose kind of way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to hear from Mr. Falondosa now. So we are in the topic of human capital and supporting human capital in those countries. What is your assessment of the current regulatory frameworks and the guiding policies for supply chains and raw materials?
Thank you very much. First, if I may, en français, remercier l'Institut Amadeus, bien sûr, et notre ami Brahim Fassifiri pour l'organisation de ce forum de la 14e édition. Now I switch to English. First of all, I'd like, if you may, I'd like to come back on the title here of Commodity Diplomacy, New Reality, New Leadership. There is definitely a new reality which is based on two pillars here. In the last 3 years, all of us here in the room, in terms of generation, we've seen something that will not give us any clawback. First, COVID, and the second, Ukraine conflict. Those two events, on the top of, I would say, the long-term disease running, which is climate change, is really totally changing the paradigm of the future and the objective of how the diplomacy is organized. Commodity diplomacy is also very much linked to how we are going to stabilize the pricing issue in the future. And I'm glad that my colleague here has been raising the question of food and starving in the coming months. There is no doubt in this respect that we will see next year, 2023, large drama in Africa in particular, but not only, and that's for sure. Because the decision we're taking now do not have any effect on the, I would say, short term. And that's because also, I would say, the diplomacy is not organized for today. All of us have been highly shocked by what's happening in the last 3 years. And this is coming now to, I would say, the second topic, new leadership here. There is, to me at least, there is no real new leadership today. Each country is trying to do its best, I would say, to preserve its social stability, its pricing issue. There is some kind of contraction and some kind of, I would say, fading away of multilateralism. And this is, I believe, really a pity. We are in a transition period of time today in which each country is trying to, get the best for the short term. Look at, and let's be pragmatic on examples. Italy with trying to get some gas in Northern Africa. They never went there before. They were at a certain level, but not to the extent of what it done. What have done the France also with I would say, the try to restore some relationship with Algeria. But also the very disputed at the European level move of Germany towards China. So everybody today, by these months, these days, is trying to accommodate the local and the immediate situation, meaning people are nervous. And this question of restoring the commodities diplomacy is really getting to be very urgent. I would just give some focus on the three pillars I believe that should be the base of this new diplomacy. First, organization of the regulation, budget and financial model have to be restored with a much more flexible and short-term view. A cap on foreign debt, for example, have to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. The second is that there is an evident selected short-term state subsidy policy which has to be organized in many countries just to support, again, the stability of prices, not expose all the people to this volatility of the prices in the car. And at the end, the third one is, of course, is economic diversification. But again, thank you very much for having raised this question of, I would say, food urgency, which today doesn't mean to be at the top of the agenda of everybody. But I can tell you, we'll see it next year.
Thank you very much. We still have a bit of time as well. So if we wanted to reform those supply chains to better serve people in populations, to serve essential needs, how would you go about it?
Forgive me, I was off. Please, could you repeat your question?
No problem. If you could support some reforms of those supply chains to better support people and the urgency, how could we make sure that those priorities are taken into account?
Well, it's again a question of who is setting the priorities politically, first of all, and how is organized the channel of this commodities diplomacy. There is no doubt that of course, United States is trying to take some kind of leadership in the organization of the different talks between the countries, but also European Union is trying to take the same. But again, a classification of what is urgent is today on the table of the state owners, I would say. The first is safety and security of the people. The food is not at the top of the agenda again. I think it has to be raised.
Absolutely. Thank you. We'll now move on to our next speaker, Mr. Kramer. So my question to you is, in your perspective, could you please give us a bit of indication of your sense of the global governance on environment, resources, climate, and energy, and on what the think tank is doing, and yes, your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. This is the last panel in this 14th edition of the MEDays. And I do want to start by thanking the people of Morocco, the city of and region of Tanger, all those who gave financial support and patronage to this event. I think this is very important. It teaches the world about Morocco, and I hope we bring ideas to Morocco. Thank you, Claire, also for that lovely introduction with that book. There is a major flaw in that book, because in the last 50 years, we had a globalized economy that is based on no respect for the environment. And the crisis in terms of global overheating, the acidification of the ocean, it is killing life as we know it in the ocean, and that is devastating for the Earth's climate, because we lose the ocean as a climate regulator, and we lose the ocean as a food source. Not immediately, not in one go, but it is definitely eroding fast, and we will see the impacts of that earlier than through global overheating on land. And we have the biodiversity loss, and we have the pollution with chemicals, with plastics. All of this was missed in that book, and the aggregate impact of all of those developments on the food supply system, but on the very human security in most of the world's regions, all of the coastal plains, all of the low river areas, all of the mountain areas, anywhere you are in a forest, anywhere you will be in more danger as a result of non-respect for the environment. The rest of, we need to save the planet as a whole, so that there is something for people to argue who should control which part over, which is so much what we do. Ladies and gentlemen, commodities, you've heard some examples here. When you look at commodity diplomacy, it is a term that comes up. It's immediately understood in today's situation, but it's actually not an established term of scholarship or of policy making. There is no diplomacy in commodities trade, as one of our other panelists wanted to say but didn't, so I do it now. For something to be a commodity, it needs to be a product, and it can be of animal, of vegetable, of mineral, or of manufactured origin, it doesn't matter. That must be available in large quantities or large numbers, that must be so homogeneous that the individual items can replace one another. And one of the key indicators is that there is a ready market for stolen commodities. And that also applies to computer chips, semiconductors, computer chips, or solar panels. Those are commodities by that definition. We've introduced today the concept that vaccines are a commodity. That is new to the world. 3 years ago, you wouldn't have said that. Now you can, and everybody immediately understands it. That is how it is changing. For many things that we recognize as commodities, the world has agreements. We have an agreement on blood diamonds, on conflict minerals. We have an agreement on ozone-depleting substances, an important commodity for certain industrial processes being phased out. We have, for every metal there is, for every fossil commodity there are international agreements, and there are market rules recognized by the market participants. All of these are agreements that have been negotiated as a result of something that we can, with hindsight, call commodity diplomacy, even if the people who did it at the time didn't call it that way. Most of these agreements are actually private sector agreements. It's industry actors doing this, and governments blessing that in some way, or in some cases just leaving it to the private sector to do. But I think it is important to recognize that we have all of these agreements, and that they are the result of an age-old practice of commodity diplomacy that perhaps started with the spice trade, and it continues all the way to the vaccines we have today. When we look at the actors in that space, diplomacy focuses on government. Most of the important actors in that field are private companies. So when we say there are only 3 countries that have strategic rice reserves, we should look at the companies, at the big companies that deal with the rice, how much they have stocked somewhere that is not controlled by government, but that is controlled by private sector market participants. In that sense, if Chile nationalizes its mines for lithium, for copper, for cobalt, for whatever, that removes it from the private sector, gives it to the diplomacy, and suddenly you can resolve issues of supply and fairness of supply through diplomacy in a way that you couldn't have done as long as the commodities were controlled by private sector, investor-owned mining companies. So depending on where you look, you see different actors coming to the fore. And I'm very grateful that somebody said there's also another type of actor here. There is absolutely no reason, looking at the overall patterns of harvest, at the overall supply of wheat and of corn, maize, and of other oilseed commodities coming out of Ukraine. The disruption in the supply could not justify the spike in prices. There were non-industry actors, meaning financial speculators and hedge funds, that were accentuating those price spikes. And this is something that indeed we need to get a handle on. And I think we need to understand that sometimes there is a physical shortage. It's very rare. Most of the time it is a weakness in the distribution system. But what we observe today is the effect of unregulated financial actors acting to enrich themselves and impoverish those who have the least resources to fight against it, and that is the poor in rich countries and everybody in poor countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was very, very informative. Our next speaker, Mr. Suat Kinigluyu. Well, I invite you to reflect. There's been a lot of content shared, and actually I invite all of our speakers, before we get to Mr. Alexander Katev as well, to reflect on each other's presentation. If you have a few things to say, we have a few minutes. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I will approach the subject from a more geostrategic perspective, and I will obviously reflect on what's been said. I think the message right now that comes out most is regulation. There's no doubt that regulation is needed, but I think it's also premature, in my view, to be hopeful on this issue that we called commodities diplomacy to be instituted anytime soon. If you look at what happened in Ukraine, which is the diplomatic side of how the international order is structured, you have basically a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council attacking an independent country that is recognized by the United Nations. So you have basically a nation state flagrantly, blatantly not playing by the rules. As long as nation states continue to look, as we are now seeing also in the commodities issues, on a national interest point of view, it's highly unlikely that that the issues that this panel aims to address will be resolved anytime soon. I'm not optimistic on this. I agree with Herr Kramer that many agreements for commodities, although done by private companies or large conglomerates, have perhaps a base on which new regulation or interstate regulation or regional regulation could be instituted. That said, I think what we've seen so far doesn't make me really hopeful. It's really everyone on their own. That said, I mean, not to be too pessimistic, I think A, the issue of climate change, B, the COVID-19 issue, and now with Ukraine, I think not because the international community or nation states out of goodwill, but because they will be forced to find responses to these. And as we've seen in throughout history, nation states rarely predict calamities that come upon them and find solutions in advance. They are usually forced to deal with situations. And I think these three threats to our global existence, climate change, COVID-19, maybe something else will come up in the future, but a pandemic, and also, of course, now the occupation, the aggression against Ukraine by the Russian Federation. I think all calls to the, and of course the resultant high rise in energy price, etc., calls to the fore of a more specified agenda on these issues. I also agree with my British colleague that the influence and effectiveness of OPEC, and despite President Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia, the insistence on raising oil prices after the meeting is again showing and somewhat confirming my personal view that all nation states or organizations such as OPEC are primarily looking after their own interests before thinking of North-South divisions or what else is happening in the other parts of the world. I come from a country whose president has been influential in getting the grain deal negotiated between Ukraine and Russia, and I understand this has been an important issue for many African countries, that the grain deal went through. Luckily, the Russians withdrew, but for reasons that are not still clear to me, the Kremlin has backstepped and the deal is now on again. But for someone like me, who is basically a foreign policy strategic person, the fragility of the system that we today live in is very scary. From what Mr. Kramer explained about the oceans to the grain deal, from COVID to Russian aggression to Ukraine, we see an extremely fragile existence. And I'm not very optimistic that this system can be reformed by forward-looking, well-intentioned political leaders, that only once a serious calamity will hit either a particular region of this planet or the whole of humanity, we will be forced to reform this.
Thank you very much. We will have the opportunity to have all of the speakers reflect on each of your conversations. Mr. Kateb, Alexandre Kateb, you wanted to, we wanted to ask you a little bit more about, in particular, the metal markets and the crisis that we've seen this year, and if you could share your reflection on this topic and more broadly on the risk associated with the financialization of commodities. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We indeed discussed this topic before the panel. I think first, before answering this very specific question, I will try to reframe it in a more general global setting. And I will have an approach that is somewhat contrarian, I would say, to what most of the other speakers have been saying, actually. Because I think here there are many people pointing to Russia and its aggression on Ukraine, and the fact that Russia is the main villain in the room now, and that all the flaws in the global economy and in the world come from this geopolitical event. So I don't agree with that, actually. I think that geopolitics should be a little bit set aside in this area, and we should reflect more soberly and keep our nerves, actually, because many of the problems that we are witnessing today, the volatility, the disruptions in supply, the price spikes, this connection between the physical markets and the financial markets don't come from the Ukraine war. They come from the reaction to COVID, as Dr. Kramer alluded as well, from the macroeconomic policies that were implemented following COVID, especially the monetary tsunami that was unleashed by the central banks, by the Federal Reserve and the other major central banks to support the economies. And they did a mistake because it was not a classical recession. It was not a repeat of the 2008 financial crisis. But nevertheless, they doubled down on this monetary expansion. And this led to an incredible array of disorders in the monetary and financial sphere that trickled down to the real economy. And we see now the consequences with this inflation. Inflation that was contained for 2 decades now is rising. And it doesn't seem even the policies that are being implemented now have some chances of success to tame this inflation or to bring it back to the level it was before. So many of these disruptions and dislocations, I would say even more than disruptions, actually are not related with the conflict. But what the conflict did, and especially the reaction to the Ukraine war by the European and by the countries and by the US through the sanctions, was that it cut from the market one major supplier of commodities. So let's say it is the elephant in the room. Russia was cut from the market initially, and it had to adapt to find new customers for its commodities. For oil, it found new customers in Asia. For natural gas, it was still supplying in Europe, but this came to a halt for different reasons, some of them related to Russia, some of them related to European open or covered policies. Nobody will know who really sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline, but there are many indices actually that point to some direction. So this is another debate here. But what I am trying to say is that actually these sanctions have amplified a disorder, a dislocation that pre-existed this conflict. And the move to try to secure commodities for each country for itself, or each regional group for itself, between, for example, the European Union and the Asian countries, for example, there was a competition to get liquefied natural gas from the US, from Australia, and from Qatar and other sources. And this led also to a massive buildup of prices. So all these phenomena are interconnected. And when we come back to the metals market, it's a very interesting case because here we have actually also the impact first of the major disruptions that came before the conflict erupted, but there was a problem with the nickel market, for example, in the early days of the invasion, of the conflict. The nickel prices in the paper market went through the roof, and this caused a technical halt of the London Metal Exchange. It was the first time the London Metal Exchange actually closed for maybe 40 years. The last time it closed, it was in 85. So you can see it is a very rare event that the London Metal Exchange, that was founded 166 years ago, had to close its trading, and it led to massive complaints from some players, hedge funds especially, because they felt they were harmed by this move, and because they lost a lot of money involved in those trades. And these claims are still ongoing now in US and other courts. And now we have another problem with the aluminium and with other metals. And this is because the LME had this fantastic idea to ban Russian metals from accessing the market. And so now there is an increasing volatility that is related to this idea of banning Russian metals from the markets. By the way, for example, for nickel, 60% of the LME stocks are Russian stocks. They are based in Rotterdam, but they are Russian stocks and owned by Russian trading companies. So if you cut off 60% of the nickel stocks from one day to the other, you can imagine the spike in prices. So we have to put things back in context to understand really what is happening.
Thank you very much for this example. So you're basically talking about either a diplomacy or a lack of diplomacy where some actors in Europe, for instance, were shooting themselves in the foot. Indeed. And disrupting their own market.
Indeed.
I want to give this opportunity to our other speakers to respond to the comments of the colleagues today. I know everyone has been taking notes, so please go ahead. Feel free to speak freely.
Great, thank you. That's the beauty. And I'm German, but I'm not a member of the German government and have no government office, so I can speak freely and admit to mistakes that the Germans may have made. However, on the blowing up of the Nord Stream 2 and both pipelines were blown up, we basically know which militaries have the capability of doing that. We know which militaries have practiced that in the past, have operated in a fashion in the region, so that we assume that they were preparing for such attacks. And if I ask my friends from the Baltic states, where Russia has in the past cut communication cables, for example, we know that that is part of their normal repertoire of war. If you can't own it, if you can't control it, then you don't want anybody else to have it. It's almost pubertarian in its attitude, but that is how most people in Europe see that particular case. And I think it is important to go back to the origin of the current crisis, which is, as you put it very clearly, an attack, unprovoked attack, unjustified attack by one member of the United Nations with veto power in the Security Council on another one, in spite of a number of agreements that that government signed, previous governments of that state signed, in order to guarantee the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. As a result of that war, of that attack, Ukraine was not able to export commodities. And it's only fair that the international community gets together and says, if you destroy Ukraine's ability to export commodities, then you can't step in and sell on behalf of Ukraine the stolen wheat, the stolen grain, or anything else. If you harm the Ukraine, the solution is relatively easy. The Russians to withdraw from Ukraine, reduce the threat, guarantee the territorial integrity, and come to the negotiating table and agree a way of resuming commodities trade of all kind as a way of earning money so that Russia can compensate Ukraine for the damages that it has done there. We need an international system for regulation. We can't wait to negotiate these things through the United Nations. It just takes too long, and I say that as somebody who has followed environmental negotiations in the UN framework for a long time. My hope is that the G20 can do it. The G7 would be quick to do it, but it doesn't have the legitimacy and the coverage and the balance between North and South and the different hemispheres. So the G20 is the right one, but only if we first exclude Russia from the process. Otherwise, we cannot hope to have any positive outcome or any speedy progress if you have a player in the room that simply wants to upturn the tables and end the rules. We need a system in the G20 excluding Russia in order to get out of this mess. That's my constructive way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I invite other speakers. Mr. Ramel, you had something.
I'm still a bit reeling from the last contribution at the end of the row, who said, if I understood him correctly, let's put the geopolitics to one side, and then waded in big time in the geopolitics. It seemed to me arguing Russia's case. I think we need to recognise that the actions of Russia in many forms is probably the worst act of aggression against a peaceful state since the Second World War, worse than we saw at the height of the Cold War from the former Soviet Union. And I think the response in terms of effective sanctions to mitigate the effect of that was absolutely the right way forward. I also slightly resiled, well, more than slightly resiled, from the notion that, the inflationary pressures have not been caused by the war in Ukraine, but are down to the tsunami, as you described it, of monetary policy in response to COVID. Well, I think most economies would have come to a standstill, certainly in the advanced world, were it not for that financial support that were given to families and businesses who would have gone to the wall without that level of financial support. So, I do think there are a variety of international factors that have driven this crisis in the commodity sector, and we need a concerted, collective international response to try and restabilise.
And please go ahead, Mr. Kamal.
Thank you. I want to add to my colleagues two comments. The first is related to the food supply. Before the COVID pandemic, I was following the world meter statistics, where we have something like 27 to 30,000 persons dying a day, every day, because of being hungry. This is nothing to do with medicine or vaccination. Also, we have 900 million persons who are not getting energy. They do not have access to energy. They do not have good living structure at all. They don't go to schools. They do not have water treatment facilities because of energy lacking. Those are two major comments were existing before the pandemic and before the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. So it means that commodity should be regulated, either by international rules or, let's say, key players or whatever it is, but needs to be regulated. We're regulated in a fair way.
Mr. Nurai, invite
Thank you. I'm not trying to divert, but I'm trying to maybe put a little bit more emphasis when you look at the new leadership, especially when it comes to food as a commodity. And I think what we're seeing now is that which way you try to cut it, the bottom line is that people are getting hungrier and starving, and that's what you need to address as a prime directive. So I think in the immediate or in the short-term kind of responses to this would be unfettered access to vulnerable people by humanitarian agencies and actors. That needs to be re-emphasized and overemphasized, no matter which side of the coin or the political divide people are on. We must reach vulnerable people, and therefore the humanitarian financing in that regard has to be augmented and supported, and really, more than ever before. That's one. In terms of more, I would say, medium term to longer term, I think there is a lot of realization now by member states, especially in Africa, African member states, governments, heads of states, prime ministers in Africa, that we are extremely in a vulnerable position. We're in a very extreme depending kind of situation. We're in a very fragile situation, and we're seeing all these changes in government, and and this was sort of like what the Arab Spring started, many years ago, and we're beginning to see now a global type of thing like that coming up. And there's now a demand also from the youth, because they are feeling hopeless and helpless. And I'm now seeing also that there's a very big surge now of the private sector getting involved. 10, 15 years ago, you don't really see international financial institutions and banks putting resources toward food or agriculture production. But now you do have that. Africa Development Bank has put $1.5 billion on the table for the next 2 years. Islamic Development Bank, about $10 billion. Afrexim Bank, about $6 billion US, all for food production, food development on the African continent. Africa has got the water, it has got the land, it has got people who are already involved. 70% of the population are involved in subsistence farming, not the huge farms that you find, abroad, where you have one person farming at 10,000 hectares. In Africa, it's not that way. We have small plots. And I think a lot more is going into that now. And the youth now are demanding. And also the youth now are the future leaders. And therefore, getting them into this space of food security and agriculture, I think we're beginning to see that trend with the innovations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fundaloza, would you like to share some thoughts?
Well, I think I think there is here probably, if I may, I would disagree with some of our panelists here. I think there is a sense of urgency that nobody's having a look to. When we speak, sorry for that, but when we speak of excluding Russia from G20, seriously, how many months, if not years, are we going to take to do that politically? It's a very serious political move and a break, if this is something which happened to be, I don't know, but which happened to be. But as it was said before, there is a sense of urgency. Days and weeks and months and winters coming, and the starving issue that are growing in certain countries. And I would not be dramatic on that, but we've seen cholera coming back again on Africa in 2 countries. It was not there since the last 10 years. It erupted in September. So why? Just because some, I would say, programs of development have seen their finance reallocated to food supply. So this program of development in water business in particular has been totally deprived from their source of financing. So the reallocation of the funds from the big banks like IDB and others is a real concern and will be impacted again, and is already impacting again dramatically some countries in Africa. So we may take some very I would say B-52's approach here, very large views on the long run. The reality of it is that we have a very short view on what's going to happen. That's my belief.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Feel free.
Thank you. It actually doesn't take much time to kick Russia out of the G20 because they were kicked out of the G8 already. It's just a decision by the others. But in the G20 case, it might not actually be necessary to exclude Russia on formal grounds and forever. The G20 has this flexible mechanism whereby within the G20 any group of countries can come together and do something voluntarily without necessarily involving all the countries. It's actually only 19 countries and the EU. So they could actually operate between the sessions, between the summits, excluding Russia from the day-to-day work in the working groups. And that is not a big nuclear bomb in diplomatic terms. It's actually a fairly operational decision that can be reversed at any point in time once Russia has withdrawn its troops from Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead, Mr.
Well, that's something that I would agree with. I also think that the G20 is a proper platform to address some of these issues that we are dealing with. And as much as Mr. Khatib's more technical perspective, and I think he understands the commodities market way better than I do, but I agree with him that governments have printed money during the COVID crisis, and of course it has increased the inflation that we have at hand. But I think there's a disconnect between this technical view and the geopolitical reality of the invasion of Ukraine. So I perhaps come from a more geostrategic background. I don't think we should accept to work with Russia despite what they have done. And part of what they've done has resulted in the grain issue, the high energy prices, and we don't even know where this will end. But if the international system or the willing countries at the moment who have united to extract a price to Russian aggression, if this is not continued through the end, basically the end result, withdrawal of Russian troops back to pre-24th of February lines, including Crimea, if this is not followed up, We have a totally screwed up system where every state, for whatever reason, could invade. My president might think the Greek islands are beautiful and we will take over the Greek islands. This would be a totally without rules. I mean, this is something that needs to be addressed. Yes, I know in Africa there are many countries who have much better relations with the Russians than many Western Europeans or NATO countries do have. And the Russians are working hard here, we know that. But this aggression cannot stand. And part of what's going on today, when it comes to food security, when it comes to high inflation, I'm not saying all of it, you're right. I'm not saying all of it is because of that, but we cannot discount the fact of energy supplies, high energy prices, grain shortages, etc., are directly a result of what Russia has done in Ukraine, and this cannot stand. If we want any constructive discussion about this, and if need be, they should be excluded from the G20. Every country should know that there is a price to attack their neighbor.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to the audience for questions, Q&A, I would like to give the opportunity to Mr. Kateb to respond.
Thank you, Claire. I have just 2 points. The first one is about G20. Well, actually, I don't think G20 is really anymore an operational platform for reaching any discussion, any decisions. And this was the case, actually, since the COVID, where we have seen this competition for vaccines between China, Russia on one side and the West on the other side. And maybe even prior to that, when Donald Trump initiated its trade war against China, which led to a total paralysis of the G20, actually. So I'm not sure, okay, you can exclude whatever country you want. Maybe the G7 will be excluded from the G20, which is what basically happens with the BRICS grouping, which has gained in prominence actually since the start of the war, and the G20 is now collapsing. The G7 still stands still, but really what you have to see is that we are discussing, I'm also a fan of geopolitics. If we think the old order is threatened by Russia and you have to restore the old order, then all that you have said is true. But if you think that we are moving into a new order that actually we started moving into years before this conflict erupted, then you have to assess this situation in view of the destination, not of where we are, from where we are departing. And the destination is that whether we like it or not, we are going to live in a world with revealing spheres of influence, and we cannot do anything about it. And this is the world that is building up. China needs Russia. I'm sorry to say that. China without Russia is castrated from its access to commodities and to critical commodities like oil and gas, because if the US closes the Malacca Strait, then China cannot import anymore any oil from the Middle East. So what is the alternative? Is basically Russia. So I just end up with this remark. The other one is Turkey. I like what Mr. Kilioglu said. Sorry for the pronunciation.
I've heard worse. Yeah.
But I think he obviously doesn't support his president's diplomacy and effort, which I think are going to rise. I think with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, actually most of the flows have been restored, if not all, compared to the pre-war period. So I don't think this is really an issue, even if we consider the food and grain situation. But this is my viewpoint.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes. We have about 20 minutes for the audience, so microphones will reach you, I believe. They're coming with the microphones. There's only one. I can give mine. It's okay. Okay. Thank you. Problem solved. So, in the order of, yeah. Thank you.
Hello everyone. My name is Khalid El Kamili. I am representing the GBC from the business school here in Tanger. And my question is, I'm so glad that you are here and you are welcome to Morocco anytime. So I am wondering how we can overcome the hungry crisis which is spreading in our content as we witness without begging the developed countries to interfere. Otherwise, are we able to rely entirely on ourselves and our resources to get through this crisis? I hope you get the point or no.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, I will make it simple.
Make it simple.
Yeah. As a human being, as an African, as a Moroccan, as we can just focus in our resources, in our minded, and how we can take independent in our thinking and have some solution. Like the Africa have a lot of resources, and how we can facilitate the information to not give them financement or give them power or I don't know what. Just give them orientation based how that our generation like youth man, how we can.
So you sorry, I'm trying to help you here. So you're saying how can young people or African countries have agencies over those decisions over natural resources? We'll take a few other questions and then let our speakers respond. There's also, go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Chris Hagedorn, independent consultant, and until this week, the executive secretary of the Committee on World Food Security of the UN. A couple points. Question, and first for Mr. Katib, to say the restoration of grain supply from the Black Sea grain deal is normalized is actually not correct. The supply so far is roughly 9 million metric tons of a supply of 22 million tons of storage of the 2021 surplus, which was unable to be shipped. So we're a far ways off from having a restoration of the trade flows. But my first question is Mr. Nuru of WFP. We all know the commodities issues, particularly food commodities, are hugely problematic. We know for Africa, which has been the focus of our discussions all week, the Chinese have been extremely aggressive in sourcing African raw materials. Now, WFP, if I understand it, China is the number 36 donor to the WFP. That means Mali and Mozambique give more to WFP than China does. Can you explain how that's acceptable to Africa? The second question, perhaps to Mr. von Ladosa, Mr. Kramer, you both spoke to price volatility. We know that's a huge problem. There's overconcentrations, that the supply chains have been broken as a result of COVID, as a further result of the Ukraine war. But what are the solutions? You've diagnosed problems, but food price volatility is a huge problem. What about a food systems stability board or some other commodity of governance or some other function of governance that can address those problems, which you've rightly identified? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Maybe another one. Oh, the lady in the front, yes.
Je suis Camélia, je suis acheteuse matières premières à la compagnie industrielle des fibres ici à Tanger. Et ma question est dirigée à Monsieur Alexandre Kateb. Ma question est, tout en n'incriminant pas la Russie, qui sont réellement les vrais acteurs qui régulent ou qui dirigent les prix de ces matières premières que nous achetons ici au Maroc, et comment, à mon échelle d'acheteuse matières premières, vous voyez que j'ai peut-être de l'influence sur l'inversement de la situation haussière. Comment, à notre échelle, nous pouvons changer l'état actuel du marché? Merci.
So we have about 15 minutes left before the big reception tonight. So we've had very in-depth questions here. I'll let our speakers respond freely.
Thank you. So the question about the youth having a say over natural resources, in your countries, I think that's a very, this is what I'm saying when I'm saying the new leadership, coming in, it's the youth. And now they are more exposed to things like all these, Google, all these various sources of information, and having their say, I think that's really very, very important. At the same time, I think, sharing platforms where we can share mutual interests for youth across the continent. I can tell you African youth are very, very much into new innovative ideas, to change the landscape, and they're very impatient. They want to do it quickly and they want to do it now. And they're demanding more from their leaders. So I think that's one of the ways in which, this can really move forward. And then the question from Chris, thank you very much. So yes, the comment about, the Chinese contribution, I think it needs to be taken also in perspective. We're talking about physical amounts, direct, money to the United Nations systems. And that is limited. I don't have the latest figures with me, but I think there are a lot of other ways in which there is support. We do have a center of excellence for food and security, for food and nutrition security based in China. We have one also in Brazil. We have one in Ivory Coast. So there are other ways in which this is done. But I think in terms of physical amounts, direct, I know, for example, there's a very big deal on the table right now for about 50,000 tons of fertilizer to be supported to African countries. But they prefer more or less bilateral kind of, between countries. So this is what I do know as well. So I don't have the figures, directly for you. Thank you.
We also have Mr. Kamal having an answer.
Thank you. As an answer to your question about can the young generation rely on themselves to satisfy their needs or not? The answer is not, simply because we do not own technology. The world leaders who own the technology, unless they provide the developing countries and the poor countries with, let's say, not the up-to-date technology, but at least the lowest level of technology that can help them in satisfying some of their needs, the answer is no. So simply it's technology, education and technology. And we have good examples in India. India has gone far away in this regard, and they've started from a very basic or even less than basic requirements, and they are now becoming the fifth or the sixth economy all over the world.
Other speakers, please, yes.
Yeah, thank you. To the question on price volatility, before becoming an environmental engineer, I was trained as an industrial manager. And the first lessons that I learned when I was in the procurement department, buying stuff in the oil and gas industry, was that if you are dependent on one source, if you have a monopoly supplier, then you increase your stock to make sure that you have time to react. And if you have any opportunity, then you don't buy it just from one source, but at least three. Never more than 70% from the first, the best, the cheapest source, and never less than 10% from any of the other sources, so that you have other links, other trading relationships that you can expand. But that together with stock. This is something that every country, that every municipality, that every company can do individually without coordination, without great policy and diplomacy, simply to improve its resilience and reduce its vulnerability. The system that we have that leads to the high volatility at the moment comes from two parts. Is one, over the last 50 years of globalization, we have emphasized efficiency too much over resilience. That needs to be redressed. And we need to understand that we need to spend more money buying from more expensive secondary sources, tertiary sources, in spite of that not being really efficient, because it is an insurance premium through which we buy resilience. And that is an advice that I would give for the reform of all sorts of commodity markets as we are talking about them today. And the second one was already discussed, that's the difference between the physical markets and the paper markets. And here we do need the Tobin tax if designed correctly, and if it does cover hedge funds and does cover commodity markets, might actually help us to cream some of the money off the paper markets that can be used in order to stabilize the physical markets. To the business school, two things. One is Morocco is a country that doesn't really know whether it's a monarchy or democracy, and I leave it to you to judge whether you got the balance right and whether the trend is the right one. But that is going on. And in Morocco, you actually have fairly good control over the natural resources. It's controlled by Office Chérifien. It's something, if you had investor-owned utilities, investor-owned companies, it would be completely different. You already have a fairly good starting point, and I would encourage you to go into politics and expand the space for the population to have a say in that. In previous years, when I came to the MEDays, there was always an opportunity to have a lunch round table meeting with students from the business school. For some reason, this year it didn't happen. Go and talk to the Amadeus Institute and demand that back.
That's an amazing advice. So focus on resiliency more so than on efficiency, maybe. Any other feedback from?
Yeah, I'd like just to give a comment on price volatility on my side. I think this is some kind of a two steps process. The first one is the immediate one, which is really what I've been talking about a few minutes ago, which is it's the responsibility of the state of organizing some kind of selected short-term subsidy policy on commodities which are absolutely basic needs for their population. And this is done, in fact, because this is also coming to, I would say, social stability in the country at the end of the day. So this transition, I call it transition period of time, we are in already. And many countries have been taking some policies on the short term for selected, basket of basic needs. Having said that, it has to be, in parallel, a full reorganization of the chain of supply on different, and this is where I would say private initiative, etc., has to flourish around this kind of thing. You have to think out of the box, because for the long run now, what was done before will never come back again, ever.
Just a couple of comments. The first question I thought was really interesting, and I think to solve the challenges within Africa, you desperately need international support in terms of debt reduction and international aid, but you also need governance reform within African states, so tackling corruption, reforming the governance process, and I think young people are very well placed to argue for those changes. So it's a dual approach. The second point is in response to Chris's question, and I'm not sure on the technicalities, but if I reflect, and we've majored a lot during this debate on the impact of Russian actions on the geopolitical situation and the impact on commodity prices. Nevertheless, if I reflect on the stance and the role of China today compared to when I was a Foreign Office Minister in the early 2000s, it's much less open, it's much more nakedly self-interested, and it is much more adversarial, both potentially militarily but also economically, and I think that's a real cause for concern that in the longer term will affect all of these issues that we're discussing.
Thank you. I think a lot has been said about the volatility, the price volatility, and I share some of the arguments about the role of the financial market, especially, and the responsibility of financial players in the volatility and in the disruptions. But, and there is a big but, the financial players are only amplifying some underlying trends. So if there are any imbalances between supply and demand, or more likely, as Dr. Kramer said, in the distribution and supply chain, then we have to fix first these supply chains and the distribution and storage facilities. I agree with that, but it will have a cost. This premium, this resiliency premium, will have to be paid by someone. So at the end of the day, it will be paid by the consumers. The consumers must be prepared to pay higher prices for longer, even though we are going into a recession, most likely, into a global recession, and prices will somewhat recede from their levels, including for industrial metals, for oil, if there are no other supply disruptions. But overall, the trend is toward lower prices, at least over the short term. But prices may come back higher once the world gets out of this recession. Will it be 2024 and 2025? I don't know. But the trend is clearly going upward. And for that, you have to fix the imbalances at the supply and demand level, and addressing the issues that are specific to the financial markets, especially for the metals market, for example. The London Metals Exchange is a total failure and has been a total mess for the last few months, actually. And unfortunately, there is no working alternative. There is the Shanghai Futures Market, but it's still modest in size and volume compared to the London metal market.
Thank you so much. We have only 2 minutes left, so I want to make the most of those 2 minutes. If somebody has a final remark, please go ahead.
Yeah, it is about the new leadership, and I think we agree that we prefer a rules-based system that is open, where every country, every company can participate, that is transparent, where most of the prices are visible, most of the transactions are visible, and not much is invisible, that is regulated in order to control the excess abuse of market power that some countries, some companies, and some geographic locations might have. And that requires international regulators, and they will have to be designed differently depending on commodities and what they are. But the principles on which the World Trading Organization is based, and that is openness, transparency, non-discrimination, most favored nation status as a principle, treat nobody worse than your best customer, all of those are good principles, and I think they are the right ones to encourage governments to go in and fix the markets that were set up by private agreements, and that includes the London Metal Exchange, which is a private organization. Its name implies that it is a government creation, but no, it is not. It is a private organization, and if it fails, then perhaps this is the moment for the G20 to set up a small working group, excluding Russia, as I said before, in order to come up with a concerted regulatory framework in order to help the London Metal Exchange out of its mess. And if the private owners of the London Metal Exchange then have to be brought on board with a bribe, then so be it, as long as it helps the world overcome the current crisis that is killing people. Thank you.
Probably good. Thank you so much. I want to really thank our speakers today for a very rich conversation, in depth, and for all the things that we've learned. Thank you also for the audience for attending. Thank you so much.